Good evening and welcome to tonight's Médecins Sans Frontières webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the Cooks River catchment where I am today, and pay my respects to ancestors and elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples also here today. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a fascinating and honest conversation about life on assignment with MSF, specifically in the field of paediatrics. With us tonight are 4 guests who know this work firsthand. Dr. Alice Toomey is a paediatric advanced trainee who completed her first assignment with MSF in northwestern Yemen in 2024, bringing her clinical expertise to children in communities with limited access to healthcare or adequate nutrition. Alison Meebus is a paediatric nurse who has completed 9 assignments with MSF since 2015, elevating bedside care for children in some of the most remote and high-need areas in the world. These include Yemen, Afghanistan, and most recently Gaza. Melissa Hojian is our paediatric nursing advisor. Melissa has worked in an array of countries in Africa, Asia, Central America, and the Middle East since her first assignment with MSF in 2011. And is joining us this evening from Paris. Dr. Mariana Gutierrez Popoca is an advisor in the Pediatric Advisor Team, and since first joining MSF in 2018, she has worked in countries including Afghanistan, DRC, Iraq, Lebanon, and Sierra Leone, and she also joins us tonight from Paris. Between them, they've seen the realities and the rewards of providing pediatric care in humanitarian emergencies. And over the next hour, we'll be hearing the personal stories of Alice and Ali and unpack together what it really means to take your pediatric skills on assignment overseas with MSF. If you don't work in medicine or nursing, but are interested in a non-medical role, please do stay with us to learn more about life on assignment and why care for children is so important. So first, let's begin with Dr. Alice Toomey, who will be sharing about her experience working as an MSF paediatrician in mountainous Haydan in the far northwest of Yemen, a country the Australian government describes as having the poorest economy in the Arabian Peninsula. It's also a country where half the population is considered to be confronted by food insecurity. Alice, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. So I went to Haydan in Yemen. So this was my first MSF project. So just to put some context into place, I went through the orientation and I thought it would take some time to have my first placement, and I got a call a week after orientation. And so I was very excited to be heading to Haydan in Yemen. So my journey there, I flew from Australia to Singapore to Ethiopia to Djibouti with a little bit of a stopover, Djibouti into Sana'a on the MSF plane into Yemen, and then from Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, a 6-hour journey up to a little mountainous village up in the northwest of Yemen. So it was quite a journey to get there in one of the most remote areas I think I'd ever been in before. So I was in a small little town in the mountains, and it was, to me, quite different as a context as compared to what I was used to, because it was a small community-based hospital run by the local Ministry of Health with MSF support. And it had 60 beds, and surprisingly to me, 90% of those were pediatric or neonate. So quite different ratios compared to what I was used to working back in Australia. In our hospital, we had a combination of a neonatal ward, a pediatric ward, infectious diseases, so looking after children with things like measles. We had cholera as well as diphtheria, and as well we had a ward that purely looked after children who had malnutrition or complications secondary to malnutrition. So quite diverse range of medical presentations at the hospital. And then alongside that, we also had an emergency department and an outpatient department. The makeup in the hospital was myself as the paediatrician in town, which to me, arriving in this small little village was quite daunting. But I had an amazing team of Yemeni doctors. So the rest of our team were foreign doctors, and they were probably equivalent to our training doctors back in other hospitals that you work in. So anywhere between having 2 years experience to 10 years experience, a lot of different skill sets amongst the local doctors, and as well as a surgeon and anaesthetist in the team. So that gave me a lot of strength. That initially I thought I'm the only pediatrician in the team, but actually there was so many people had amazing skill sets, and particularly the Yemeni doctors really at the start really took me on the journey and taught me a lot about the lay of the land in the hospital and managing some conditions which I'd actually never had experience in before. So I felt really fortunate to have that team when I arrived already.
Alice, I actually wanted to ask you about that, about the conditions of the children that you were seeing, and whether there were conditions that you hadn't seen before, or maybe there was a difference in the severity, and how you managed that sort of with that team. But perhaps, for you, there was something new about what you were seeing.
Yeah, and I think that was the interesting part of learning from each other. So, whilst I came with such a different skill set and different knowledge, the local doctors had knowledge that they shared with myself as well. And so, for example, I knew about sickle cell anemia. I'd managed it in a high resource setting before, but had a lot of the complications I'd only read about in textbooks. And so I had a lot of patients with complications secondary to sickle cell anemia that I was managing. And so initially, I was learning a lot from the doctors, but then going away and adding even more knowledge from things I'd already read before or stuff I'd already learned. I could then practice that knowledge and then teach back as well. Particularly in the context of malnutrition, again, a lot of the complications were I hadn't had a lot of experience in before, but again, it was a quick, steep learning curve of just sharing that knowledge with locals, building on it, and me learning myself and reading, and also bringing my own expertise into that role. By the end, I was the one leading different teaching sessions on malnutrition with the locals. So it was this give and take situation in regards to sharing skills, but also learning. The other context was that we had limited resources. So whilst we had a high dependency unit in our hospital, that consisted of 2 beds, and the maximum amount of therapies we could have offer was either oxygen via a mask or peripheral noradrenaline. But using peripheral noradrenaline was very rare. I think there's a picture up of a little girl that I looked after, and she was a baby who came in with sepsis and multi-organ failure. And for any children who presented that unwell, we'd be supported by the local hospitals that were a couple of hours away and refer children to those services. But if families couldn't afford it or had other children they were caring for, they would opt to be cared for in our facility. And that was quite a challenge in the role in managing these children, which I was used to being in a big intensive care unit in a high resource setting, to being in a small unit with myself as the pediatrician and the local doctors, and all we had was peripheral noradrenaline. But despite those challenges, that little girl somehow, unbeknownst to me, survived. She was so incredibly resilient, and I think that's something that I really recognized in the children and the population we were caring for there, is just the resilience in some of those children and how they could just bounce back so quickly despite being so unwell.
Yeah. How would you describe a typical day?
So when people ask me this, I think my days never ended. So I was on call 24/7. But a day would generally start by getting to the hospital early, and we'd normally have a manager's meeting in the hospital. And I would also assist the local doctors. So the local Yemeni doctors more or less ran the hospital and would see patients and do ward rounds. But as the paediatrician in the hospital, they would consult for myself, or I'd oversee different practices happening in the hospital and support them, and as well as teach. So I typically join the ward round in the handover, in the morning. And so I would create a list of all the 50 or so patients that I'd have for the week, and I'd do a bedside quick handover from the day doctor to the night doctor. And at that point, we'd try and be quick, but I'd give them a little bit of a brief idea if we could change things then, or change management for patients, or I was a bit concerned about other patients. So I'd try and attend to that, to all the kids in the hospital in the morning. And then the rest of the morning was spent going to complex or critical patients in emergency, attending deliveries where we were needing to perform neonatal resuscitation, attending to complex cases in the outpatient department, so things that were undifferentiated or quite paediatric specific. So a lot of general pediatrics that I think you tend to kind of be in that role in a high resource setting, in that you're overseeing a lot of different parts in a lot of different departments. But then on top of that, I would run teaching sessions, morbidity and mortality meetings, as well as often reviewing any guidelines or policies that we needed to review in the hospital, and helping teach or implement those in different areas that we needed throughout the hospital. Then I'd generally, by the afternoon, do another ward round and brush up things by the evening, to go home, to be called or call back in overnight. But it was I found through my time there, a lot of the Yemeni doctors were even becoming more and more independent. So whilst that 24/7 on call sounded a lot, it was with a lot of support that, and actually, managing the team underneath, that I could pull back a little bit and let them lead more the clinical work and be in the background, providing more teaching and reviewing policies and procedures in the hospital.
It does still sound like a heavy workload though. And you said a little bit about how you managed it, but were there some challenges? What were your, I suppose, coping mechanisms really for, what was essentially a heavy workload?
Yeah, so I think I would say this when I was over there. To me, I feel like COVID was a bit of a blessing to have gone through that beforehand, because I'd really learned how to make my own fun or manage in a lockdown situation. So when in our situation in Hayden, we were living in a compound, and we could go to the local markets on a Saturday to get our food for the week. And we could at times walk to the hospital, but that wasn't always the case. And so because of the confinement we had, we had to make our own fun at home. So I made a twister board for New Year's Eve one year. I made myself a pool on the rooftop because I just felt sometimes I needed to lie in a body of water and close my eyes and feel like I was floating. We had nights on the roof with fires and singing music. And then every Thursday evening, we'd go to the local doctor's house to sit around together and chew cut and learn about their culture. And that brought me a lot of joy, the fact that despite we were quite confined with what we could do, just using what we had gave me a lot of joy and helped. And as well as at the hospital, I would organise morning teas with the different colleagues in the hospital, because it was difficult that we couldn't be in the local culture. I found that quite hard, not being able to go to local people's homes for dinner or have more insight into that local culture. So taking the opportunities where they were really, I think, benefited myself and the team, and also working with the local team as well, just trying to have these moments together where we could.
So you mentioned that interaction with the local staff, that you couldn't get out yourself to sort of understand more of the context in people's lives. But what did you learn about people's lives, and what inevitably there's a comparison that goes on. It's not a judgmental one, but there are differences in sort of ways of life and the way people interact.
I,
What did you discover? What did you learn? What are your reflections on that?
I think I was really fortunate with my relationship with the local doctors, that despite not being able to spend a lot of social time outside of work, that I managed to form really beautiful bonds with a lot of the local doctors, and particularly the women. So where we were, there were 3 Yemeni female doctors in the town, and that was new over the last few years. Previous to that, there weren't female doctors in the hospital. During Ramadan, we organised a big dinner together, and I think one of the bonding moments was we'd always been eating with the men all the time, the male doctors, and there was always rice and meat. And then we had a dinner during Ramadan, and I'd organised all the female doctors and the nurses to come and us to break the fast together in the evening. And all the women had vegetables and all this beautiful food, and they were all laughing that all the men just want meat. And I thought, we're all the same. So that's pretty similar in my culture as well. So I think just there were obviously differences in culture, but I think those moments of spending time together makes you really bond. And yeah, I thought that was quite funny.
Yeah. You mentioned at the very beginning that, it was probably the furthest you traveled or the most remote place that you'd been to. So how did you feel in that remote environment? When you finally got to Yemen and maybe you're sort of looking back at Australia and thinking, I've come a long way, there is a sense of distance, and then you are in a different environment every day. How did that remoteness sort of affect you, I suppose?
Yeah, so I think for me, I felt so incredibly lucky. I When the town I was in Haydan in Yemen, uh, because it's quite a sacred town for the local community, and we weren't allowed to take photos of the community. The authorities wouldn't like the foreigners taking photos where we were, and so a lot of the landscape and access to that culture is so limited. So for me, I found that having this ability to have the opportunity to be in this culture, and despite the hardships that existed in the everyday work and the remoteness of Haydan itself, and not only the remoteness of the town, but being isolated I mean, not necessarily isolated, there was beautiful people there with us at home, but living in a compound did feel somewhat restricted at times. But I just remember I'd wake up in the morning and look out the window and say, wow, I cannot believe that I'm in this town where no one sees these mountains with their bare eyes outside of us, group of MSF workers and the locals, that I just felt so incredibly lucky. And I had worked so hard to get to that point, to be working with MSF, that I think that helped carry the positive side of it, because I just felt really blessed to have that opportunity.
Yeah, that's a lovely reflection. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the children that you saw, the families of the children that you met? Any other reflections?
I, the difficulty was the language barrier, I think, with a lot of the families I met. So whilst the Yemeni doctors could speak English, the locals could only speak Arabic. And so that I found difficult in having that language barrier with the local families. But there was a top floor that was only had females on it. And so when the women were on the top floor and there were no men present, the women could take their niqabs off and I could take my scarf off. And there was this really special moment with those families that we could kind of remove that. And despite having a language barrier, be together with the patients. And so I would often be there cuddling their children or walking around the ward. And I had some really special moments with some of the mothers of the children that I looked after, despite the language barrier at that point. Although I did learn a little bit of Arabic, and today I had a little child who came into my my practice from, their family were from Gaza, and I'd met them the other week, and he walked in and he goes, "That's the Arabic speaking doctor." Thought, oh gosh, my Arabic's pretty bad.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, to have that linkage. And we all know that even speaking a little bit of someone's language, right, it creates a bridge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found that really beautiful. Even though I could learn a few words, it really did kind of break down that language barrier to an extent.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to pause now, and I want, if you're watching, joining us tonight, please do pose any questions that you have. If you're a paediatrician or an advanced paediatric trainee, yeah, if you have any questions for Alice, please do save them up or put them in the chat so that we have them when we come to the Q&A, which we'll have at the end. But now I'm going to hand over to Alison Meebus, who has completed assignments managing nursing activities as nursing activity manager, but also providing training and implementation support for new technology in our newborn and paediatric intensive care units. Ali has also worked in northwestern Yemen in Hamir. Ali, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I was in Hamir in late 2019, 2020, and it was my 5th mission with MSF, and I think it's still one of my favourite missions. And I was just reflecting on it then. So I was asked if I'd like to go to Yemen in the middle of the year to leave. I think we'd said about 3 months later, and it actually took about 6 months for my visa to come through, which was a little bit daunting at the time, but it does happen and you do eventually get to go. So there was that small delay, which can happen sometimes. And I was in Hamir, which is the capital of one of the bigger governorates in Yemen. And when I was there, Yemen had been in a civil war since 2015. And in the hospital, so we were working in the Al Salam hospital in Hamir, and MSF had been supporting the Ministry of Health there since 2010. And the hospital, from memory, had over 200 beds, and it was the biggest hospital, Ministry of Health hospital in the governorate. And we accepted, we had an emergency department, an adult surgical and medical wards. We had a maternity, we had paediatrics, and that had both medical and surgical paediatrics, a malnutrition unit, as well as a neonatal unit. So it was a very busy, big hospital providing a lot of services. And I went as the clinical support nurse. That focus is really on capacity building and quality improvement of your local colleagues. And I actually really love the role. I really love the training and capacity building, because there's something really special about being able to empower nurses to build their skills and confidence that allow them to reach their full potential as nurses, but also empower them to care for their community. I think it's a really special role, and I felt really privileged to be able to go there and do that. And I had a special objective of this assignment, was to implement high flow oxygen, which you may be familiar with as paediatric, if you've worked in paediatrics or neonates. So I think in Australia we have been using high flow for over 15 years, but it was the first time MSF was using high flow at all. And so that was pretty exciting to be able to be there and do that. The populations that we were working with the high flow with was in the paediatric department, because pneumonia is the biggest killer of children under the age of 5. And before we implemented high flow, the standard of care was, or the highest level of care, similar to what Alice said, was a non-rebreather mask with 10 litres of oxygen. And for neonates, it's really nasal prong oxygen, which you can give 2 litres of. So while it's really commonplace in Australia, or at least in the institutions I worked in, to have high flow available, it was the first time in MSF. So we were using it in the children with pneumonia and bronchiolitis in the paediatric units. And then we had a neonatal unit that we were also using the high flow in. Yeah.
So that you went to implement this new technology, but you're still sort of the newbie in town. You're the newbie in the team. So how do you form those relationships?
Yeah, I think,
as someone who's got to come in and teach, but also they all know each other, but you don't know them.
yeah, it's a good question. And I think a lot of it is around sitting back to begin with and watching and learning and listening. If there has been someone in your position before, you may get a handover. You may have an opportunity to work with them for a couple of days at the end of their mission and at the start of your mission. But really, to begin with, it was very much around sitting back, listening, asking questions, really trying to understand what their experience is, particularly around the level of care, their assessments, and understanding their patient population, identifying the knowledge gaps, and then coming up with creative ways to overcome some of those knowledge gaps. So to begin with, I would go on the ward round with the team, which took almost the whole morning by the time we went to our paediatric high dependency unit, and then down to our neonatal unit that I think had 25 beds, but sometimes we had 28 patients. And then in the afternoon, sitting with my really, the beautiful nursing supervisors and learning from them about the way that they find that their team learns best, about what their challenges have been, about what their practices is. And then from that, working out how we were going to add high flow into part of their activity. And in the end, we did a one day, we broke them up into small groups, and we did a day facilitated workshop, which was super fun. And then did a bedside competency. And that was also really special to be able to work one-on-one and to get to know the nurses a little bit more. Yeah.
And were there nonetheless any challenges? Did you have enough time to achieve what you wanted to do? Were there any sort of obstacles? You know, they don't have to have been obstacles, but did you have enough? Did you have what you needed to be able to achieve what you wanted to do with certain outcomes before you finished your assignment?
Yeah, so there were definitely challenges. I think because it was the first time we had tried to use high flow in paediatrics in MSF, we had the paediatric team, so Melissa, the paediatric advisor, nursing advisor, and one of the paediatric advisors had written a guideline, but then we had to put it into practice. And with that, we had to adapt it. But I was never on my own doing that. There was always someone I could write an email to or send a WhatsApp message to help problem solve some of those problems as they came up. And then I think one of the other challenges for me, and it kind of comes up on every mission in a different way, but we only had 3 high-flow machines, but we had 60 children in the paediatrics and 30 children in the neonates. And we had 3 machines because it was an implementation phase of, we wanted to see if it was possible to do it in an MSF setting. It's super expensive. The consumables are really expensive. And everything in Yemen had to be imported. So everything has to be flown in from the consumables, including the bags of water we used. So we wanted to start with a small number of machines to see what was possible. And with that then becomes the ethical dilemma of which patients do you offer high flow to when on any given day there was more than 3 patients who could benefit from high flow. And often it's not the sickest patient that would benefit from high flow. Actually, it's the child that still has some reserves left that high flow will help the most. And that can be super difficult and really challenging for you and challenging for your colleagues who may have seen high flow work a couple of times to begin with, and then comes the day when you have to decide which patients most fit the criteria, and that might not be the sickest child.
Yeah. You also implemented high flow in Herat in Western Afghanistan and took some of that learning from Yemen, no doubt with you. But is there any sort of comparison you can make, or how was it the second time? And were there any features of the situation in Herat that were different? Because we haven't talked about that situation yet. But yeah, how did that go?
So Herat, well, it was very similar. It was very different as well. So Herat is in the west of Afghanistan. And so I was there at the end of last year, the beginning of this year. The project, so the MSF has been in Herat since 2018. And the activities in that project have changed a lot over the last 8 years as they've responded to the needs in the community. So it started out supporting the Ministry of Health adult emergency department, and then it moved into an ITFC project, and then, a project that supports malnutrition.
Inpatient Therapeutic Feeding Centre, yep.
And then it adapted again to general paediatrics. And on top of that, there's been a change in government and several very large measles outbreaks. So the project in Herat was a much newer project. It was still trying to establish itself a little bit as a paediatric hospital, which did mean it was a little bit, you had to adapt the training and change it a little bit to meet that population's needs. And also it was a slightly different population in that it was solely a paediatric medical facility that MSF was supporting. While there was still lots of pneumonia, there was also lots of TB, which meant, again, that we had to restructure our protocols and guidelines. But again, there are the people within MSF who can help you and support you when you have to do those things.
Yeah. And last question about Herat. So what was the reception of the team that you trained in having access to this new therapy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think They were excited. I think similar to Yemen, but prior to this, the highest level of care they could provide children with was oxygen with a non-rebreather bag, so 10 litres, and they have a very large population of children who do present with respiratory illnesses. But I think it took a bit longer in Afghanistan than it did in Yemen, and I think that was because it was multifactorial. The population at the time, there was lots of new decrees, so women weren't allowed to. So it's there when you weren't allowed to play music anymore out loud. I'm trying to think of all the decrees. There was about women in education. So there was a lot of political stress, which made the training, I think, it impacts on people's ability to be able to concentrate and dedicate to learning. And so with that, you have to adapt your training. And it just took longer, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting reflection. I think it could apply in other settings as well, you know, crisis affected communities and, you know, the sort of bandwidth of staff as much as the, because they're members of the local community as well, facing whatever challenges they are. Yeah. When you look back on, you've done a lot of assignments, but when you look back on them, so what are some of the challenges or sort of personal growth that you've been through or professional growth? You have quite, a series of assignments to look back on, but is there anything that you'd like to share tonight?
I think the real joy I get out of it and the reason why I keep coming back is just the absolute privilege of working with your national colleagues and helping them to build their skills or build their confidence or just helping them reach their full potentials as nurses, and the difference and watching as they're empowered to make a difference in their community is really, really special. I think you get as much as you give. You probably actually grow more than the staff you work with. And whether that's clinically, like in some of the projects I've worked on, we've had you have to rely solely on your assessment skills. You cannot run blood tests. There's no X-ray, there's no ultrasound, there's no CT. So you definitely can develop your assessment skills. And I've definitely grown in other ways as well.
I actually, there was one question I perhaps should have asked earlier, but actually it doesn't matter when I asked the question, but we did want to talk about what it's like working as a nurse and you, or a pediatric nurse, but when there's no pediatrician around, you know, when you don't have the medical doctor alongside you, sort of for you to be able to work together when it's just you.
So when I was in Yemen implementing high flow, there was no international pediatrician, but we had two super lovely national pediatricians who were really fun to work with, and it was really fun to work with high flow with them. So that was really lovely. I'm trying to think. Then most recently in Gaza, there was, while the national doctors were very skilled, there was no pediatrician in our team. And with that does come challenges. But again, there's always people who you can refer to. So whether that's a medical team leader or a medical coordinator or an advisor who you can ask questions to, who can help you on the ground.
Okay, thank you. We have one more photo from you, and this is in the spirit of Alice's candid shots. We have a little candid shot from you. You know, you might never experience this moment again, but can you tell us what's happening in the photograph?
So this was a photo from Hayden, actually, so where Alice was. So my position in Yemen was I was actually the paediatric nurse across both the of two of the MSF activities. So I would travel between the two. And this photo was taken in Hayden. And when I was in Hayden, we were still actually building the hospital. And so the medical office was in a tent across the street from the actual hospital. And when it rained, the road flooded up to your knees and you couldn't cross it. And so on this particular day, we had been in the medical tent having a meeting, and it started raining and we could not leave. And I think we spent about 3 hours in the tent. And I think I just found all these plastic shoes and buckets in the office when I was looking for something to do to entertain myself. Hence the bucket. Maybe it would have been helpful. I could have walked across the hospital in it.
Yes, yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, thank you for sharing all your reflections and experience, but also for sharing that photo. And it was lovely solidarity between you and Alice to share those photographs. We're going to switch to the Q&A now. And we've got 15 minutes, so we've got some good time for some questions and answers. We welcome any questions or answers. Melissa, who we introduced earlier, and also Mariana are also here. If you have any questions for them, they'll do a little wrap up at the end of sort of what the skills are that are needed and the needs that we're responding to in MSF, giving their advice as advisors. But yes, we would love to see some questions. So I've got access to the chat and we've got a few questions coming up. So, all right, the first one. I am a neonatal nurse. I do not have much pediatric experience, i.e. with older infants or children. Do you need the breadth of skills across both neonatal and pediatric nursing for a role? Who would feel most comfortable answering that? Is that a Melissa answer?
Sure, I can jump in on that
Thanks.
one. Thanks for the question. I think it's a really important question. What many people may not realize is over 70% of the patients that we see are children. And within that, a large majority are neonates. As a nurse, we certainly look for nurses who are experienced in different areas and specialized in different areas, like neonates, like pediatrics. But with nursing being so transversal and the needs that we have in a lot of our projects changing as well, I think what's really important for any nurse to think about is, what is your area of expertise, but what else can you offer? What maybe you have really good experience in infection control, or maybe palliative care, or maybe many other things. You could be a neonatal nurse with pediatric experience, a pediatric nurse with neonatal experience, remote area. Australia is really unique in the opportunities it offers to our healthcare staff to work remote, which is really a big asset for a lot of our healthcare professionals in adapting to some of the contexts that we work. So I think that's important to think about is, certainly your technical capacity as a nurse, but to dig a little deeper into what that means as well, where your experience is. And certainly there's lots of needs as we're evolving, as we're looking at increasing our levels of care, like the implementation of high flow that Ali mentioned, those sorts of skills, very specific, that we're looking for as well. So don't be too hesitant to limit yourself on just being a neonatal nurse. I'm sure you have lots of other skills that we're also looking for to offer beyond. And I might just take this opportunity to add as well that besides the technical, there's also the management, supervision skills, learning and development, experience in conducting trainings, setting different learning and development objectives, different methodologies. So all of this really builds a good profile for as a nurse in MSF.
Thanks so much, Melissa. So the next question is, what would be your core advice to prepare as a paediatrician if I'm thinking of working for MSF? So I'm going to throw to Alice first, and then Mariana can do, I'm sure you can add something.
That's a great question, and that is definitely something that I was thinking about before I went on my first project. I think that I remember my pediatric advisor saying almost you can't prepare, and every project is so different that you work on, and often it's a steep learning curve. It does. Maybe Ali can vouch for that every project is different, and so you're constantly learning new skills. And part that I took from the skills that I could share were things like teaching and implementing guidelines and protocols and seeing what other people had implemented previously, and rather than recreate the wheel, keep teaching and re-implementing those things and utilizing my pediatric knowledge alongside other people. So I think everyone brings different skills to the role depending on what your background is. So I don't know if that really answers it about preparing as such, but
no, that's great. Thank you. Because Mariana, you can probably also add some things.
Yeah,
Especially,
so I
having
think
worked yourself as a pediatrician and now looking at it from an advisor point of view.
definitely. I think one of the main things that is important to keep in mind in this case is that you will probably be the only pediatrician in the field, and that what you bring to the field isn't only the expertise in pediatrics, but you have to work with a broad range of people working in different areas of the hospital, and you also need to sort of like think of a more integrated care. So in your hospital in Australia, you may have a dedicated team for different things, and you may do referrals, and you may get support, technical support from other specialists. Here, you're going to be the only pediatrician. So to keep in mind that you will need to be a bit resourceful, and that you can always ask for advice from your pediatric advisors, from the nursing advisors. You don't need to know it all, but at the same time, you will be sort of like the lead in pediatrics. And the other thing that I think is really important is to consider that in the same way that you are bringing something to the project, be prepared to learn a lot, because there's going to be a lot of things that you might never have encountered before in your pediatric training, notably tropical diseases that don't happen in your country or your area, and you be ready to learn from the experience of the local staff, because it is important to see this as an exchange. So I think the best way to prepare is to be open for learning, and at the same time be ready to be the only pediatrician in that project.
Thanks so much, Mariana. This is a question to Ali and to Alice. So how do you balance life at home and continuing employment in Australia with going on assignment? Especially Ali, considering that you have kept going on assignment.
Yeah, so I've been really lucky. I have a hospital that's pretty supportive. So I've normally tried to, it changes. There are some years I do an assignment every year. There's years, there's been blocks of years where I've done no assignments. There's been a couple of years where I've done 2 assignments. So I think it's probably a little bit easier for nursing, because there's often you can source some casual opportunities to be able to work both in Australia and be able to do deployments. And like I said, I'm really lucky. I work for a hospital that's fairly supporting, and I'm happy to give me leave without pay. But I think when you're talking about the balance, it's not just the work. I find spending time home in Australia with my friends and family is really grounding for me. And I think the other thing, it's not just employment opportunities. I think also it's important to keep up your skills and professional development as well. And yes, you do learn and develop new skills overseas, but I think it's also important to keep up your professional development in Australia, partly because you need to for your registration, but yeah.
Yeah. And Alice, you've done that one assignment, but you will probably, when you applied, did you have any uncertainty about could you afford to be away for that time? How did you think this through and sort of, make it possible for you to go on assignment as well?
Yeah, so I was very lucky in that my workplace was supportive. So I had a 3-year contract as an advanced trainee, and so my workplace were happy for me to take 6 months leave without pay and supported that decision. So yeah, I felt quite fortunate, but at the same time, if I'm to take another break anytime soon from my current employment in Sydney, it would be a negotiation at that point again.
Yeah.
And in terms of the balance, one of the things that I almost found easier when I was working abroad was that I didn't have any of the lifestyle or the to-do list things pulling me in separate places on placement. So I felt that when I worked in Yemen, I could give that my all, whereas I find actually back home, I find the everyday balance more difficult in Australia.
Yeah, very interesting. Yes, our to-do lists. We've got a question. Does the demand for paediatric nurses change the recruitment criteria? So the simple answer is no, that we have the criteria outlined on the website, and they're the criteria for paediatric nurses. And I don't know if you want to add something, Melissa, but that's the essential criteria, isn't it? Not really malleable. Yeah, that's great. Do we have any assignments that require experience in pediatric surgery?
Maybe I can jump in on that one.
Yeah, that would be great, Mariana. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, we do have missions where we would require some pediatric surgery experience, but those are like very specific missions. So in general, when you enter the pool as a pediatrician, you will be offered different sorts of missions where you will be told from the very beginning what the mission is about. So if this mission is more of a malnutrition project, if it's a general pediatrics project, if it's a neonatal project, if it has all those 3 components in one, and if it's maybe a surgical project where surgical projects are usually mixed projects where we see adults and children. So if this is a surgical project where you will have post-surgical patients. Now, does it require experience in pediatric surgery as you performing the surgery? Not really. So you will be taking care of post-op patients. We do have sometimes a requirement of pediatric surgeons to go to very specific projects, but particularly for this session, we are aiming this for pediatricians in general, not for pediatric surgeons.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We've now got 4 minutes left. Is this a good time for Melissa and Mariana for you to do a little bit of a wrap up just of, who we're looking for and the needs that they were responding to? Yeah.
Okay, yes.
I see you conferring between the two of you. Who's going to go first?
Yeah. So just maybe Yeah, some strategic points to think about. As I've mentioned before, considering that you might be the only pediatrician in the ground, and this is sometimes very daunting for us as medicals. We are very used to working in, again, environments where you may have other specialties that you can refer to, but also considering that the level of care that we can offer in many of our missions will not be the same level of care that you have back in Australia. So this also means, and I want to emphasize on this, is like we try to work on doing the basics very well, because the basics will benefit the majority of the population. So we are not aiming to have this like super high-end, state-of-the-art intensive care sort of thing. We will go for the interventions that will benefit most of the population. So, for example, when we say that we're looking for pediatricians with neonatal experience, my experience with that recruitment part has been that many of the pediatricians coming from high income settings may feel like, oh, but I've never actually worked at a neonatal intensive care unit. It's not super relevant that you have not done that, because we're not going to have mechanical ventilators or syringe continuous infusions of vasopressors, or we're never going to have high frequency ventilation. We're not going to have those kinds of things. We're aiming for, do you know how to support a breastfeeding mother? Do you know how to promote zero separation, patient-centered care, and the same for pediatrics? Do you know how to take care of a patient with shock? And again, you will learn a lot of tropical medicine, because you will not have the same level of experience as the nationally hired staff. So be ready to learn that part, but also be ready to bring your expertise as a pediatrician to increase the overall quality of the care that we offer. So yeah, that would be kind of like my key message here.
Okay. Melissa, there's a question that just slipped in. Are you okay to answer that? Because it might tie in with what you were going to share. So I'm a pediatric nurse who is in a very large, very well-resourced tertiary hospital. I've just moved to a remote hospital. What can I do to gain experience to help prepare if I'm interested in MSF?
Good question. So like I mentioned before, that nursing is so transversal, and we can have a lot of skills, and we are certainly looking for pediatric nurses, neonatal nurses, and alternatively, same but different, nurses experienced in pediatrics and nurses experienced in neonates. So you don't necessarily have to have that specialization. But the more that you can add to your profile, the better. So as I mentioned before, the remote experience, which it looks like you're getting experience in different departments within the hospital as well. So not, for example, let's say, for example, spending 5 years working in one department, but being able to have a varied experience, because that will also help with your adapting when you get to an MSF project. What's different with nursing compared to doctors is nurses tend to, as a first assignment nurse, you will likely be in a clinical support nurse position, like Ali mentioned, so very much from the technical side. But then very quickly, as nurses continue as internationally recruited, you tend to move into more of management roles and supervision roles. So that type of experience as well is always very useful, even if that means as the nurse in charge of your shift. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the manager of your department, but those skills will certainly help. And then experience in delivering different types of trainings, different methodologies. Simulations is very, very useful, and something that we're integrating a lot into our projects right now as a methodology in our learning. And then being a peds nurse, the variety of IPC experience, what is really useful, and I mentioned previously and I'll mention again, high flow. We use the Airvo 2, Airvo 3 machines, which is used in a lot of hospitals throughout Australia. So again, that provides that experience that is really useful for Australian nurses and doctors. And just to remember as well that, the majority of our teams are actually locally recruited colleagues. So you will be working with nursing and medical staff who are recruited within the country that we work. And I like it's been mentioned a lot by Alice and Ali, their experiences working with the team and that exchange of knowledge, which is so important. But it's also what we consider when we look at sending IMS as well, as what skills can you take that really benefit the team and can add some capacity to our colleagues.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, it's time really to say thank you to everyone, because 2 past the hour. So thank you to Alice and Ali for sharing your experiences and your personal reflections and some candid photos, as I said earlier, which I think really added to the promise of the webinar. Thank you to Melissa, Mariana, for your technical advice and your insights. And we're very thankful to you, the viewers, as well, for being so attentive and getting involved in the Q&A. You can find out more details about working with MSF and how to apply on our website. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. Good night.